America's most notorious serial killers, Ted Bundy. And he confessed to killing 2 women right here in Idaho.
He decapitated at least 12 of his victims.
Washington State will enforce the ultimate penalty. Wesley Dodd will die for killing 3 small boys.
What the last day looks like for death row inmates. Most of us have thought about what we would do if we knew it was our last day alive, where we would go, who we would call, what we would eat. But for death row inmates, that question is not hypothetical. They know the exact date, sometimes the exact hour, and how they spend those final moments says a lot about who they really are. So here are 8 cases that show what the last day actually looks like when the clock runs out for good. Gary Gilmore in.
Gary Gilmore, who was convicted of murdering 2 people in Utah County, became the first person to be executed.
July 1976. A 35-year-old career criminal named Gary Gilmore robbed a gas station in Orem, Utah, and shot the attendant, 24-year-old law student Max Jensen, in the back of the head. Jensen had handed over the money and laid face down on the floor, but Gilmore pulled the trigger anyway. The very next night, the same thing happened at a motel in Provo, where Gilmore shot 26-year-old manager Benny Bushnell during another robbery. When police asked him why, Gilmore just said, "I don't know. I don't have a reason." By that point, Gilmore had spent most of his adult life locked up, starting at 14 when he was sent to a reformatory, and cycling through convictions for car theft, armed robbery, and assault across Oregon and Utah. After a swift conviction, Gilmore did something almost nobody on death row ever does. Instead of fighting the sentence, he demanded it. Utah gave condemned inmates a choice between hanging and a firing squad, and Gilmore picked the rifles, saying he feared a hanging could be botched. While awaiting execution, Gilmore and his girlfriend, Nicole Barrett, attempted a joint overdose using smuggled sleeping pills. Both survived, and Gilmore tried again a month later on his own. The ACLU fought hard to intervene on his behalf, filing stays of execution against his wishes, but Gilmore went on a hunger strike to protest the delays. But what makes this case unforgettable is how the last day actually played out. On the night of January 16, 1977, the prison allowed Gilmore an all-night gathering in the mess hall with friends and family. The mood was surprisingly relaxed. Relatives came in, conversations flowed, and Gilmore was reportedly in good spirits for most of the evening. Uncle Vern D'Amico later admitted that he had smuggled in 3 small bottles of Jack Daniels, which Gilmore drank. Then, Johnny Cash, his favorite singer, called the prison and sang to him over the phone. Gilmore tried to sing along. At some point during the night, Gilmore recorded a tape for his girlfriend, Nicole Barrett, who was in a mental hospital after a failed overdose attempt. In the recording, Gilmore asked Nicole to take her own life so they could be together. Even in his final hours, that possessive intensity had not faded. A last meal of steak, potatoes, milk, and coffee was served, but Gilmore only touched the milk and coffee. Before leaving for the execution, Gilmore gave his watch to Vern and asked him to pass it along to Nicole. Gilmore had deliberately broken the watch at his estimated time of execution. Around 7:53 a.m., a prison van carried Gilmore the half-mile from his cell to an old abandoned cannery behind Utah State Prison in Draper. Inside, an old mahogany office chair with a black vinyl seat waited, with a wall of sandbags stacked behind it. 5 local police officers stood hidden behind a curtain, each with a .30-30 caliber rifle aimed through a small hole. 4 had live rounds, and 1 had a blank, so none could be certain who fired the fatal shots. A paper target was pinned directly over his heart, and a black corduroy hood placed over his head, even though Gilmore had asked to face the rifles uncovered. That request was denied. When asked for any last words, Gilmore simply said, "Let's do it." The prison chaplain administered last rites, and Gilmore whispered his true final words in Latin, Dominus vobiscum, meaning, "The Lord be with you," at 8:07 a.m. On the 17th of January, 1977, all 4 live rounds struck within 2 inches of each other. Movement continued for about 15 to 20 seconds afterward, but the medical examiner confirmed death came within 2 minutes. Outside, about 60 death penalty opponents stood silently in 20-degree weather, many of whom had been there all night. Gilmore became the first person executed in the United States in nearly a decade, and within hours of his death, 2 people had already received his donated corneas. In accordance with his wishes, his pituitary gland, liver, and kidneys were also donated for medical research. What remained of his body was cremated the same day, with ashes scattered from a plane over Provo. Barbara Graham, The crime that put Barbara Graham on death row started with a rumor. Word had spread through criminal circles that an elderly widow in Burbank, California, named Mabel Monahan, had a fortune stashed inside her house, supposedly left behind by a wealthy ex-son-in-law. On the 9th of March, 1953, Graham and a crew that included Emmett Perkins, Jack Santo, and a man named John True drove to Monahan's home. Graham, the only woman in the group, knocked on the door because an older woman would be more likely to open it for her. Once inside, the crew tore the house apart looking for cash and jewelry, but found nothing. The 64-year-old Monahan was beaten during the ordeal and died from her injuries. The press gave Graham a name that stuck, Bloody Babs. After a sensational trial that drew national press coverage, Graham was convicted of first-degree murder, alongside Perkins and Santo, all three receiving the death penalty. She was 31 years old, a mother of 3, and had already lived a life full of trouble. Raised by strangers after her mother was sent to a reformatory, divorced multiple times, and caught up in drugs and gambling from her early 20s. At one point during the trial, she told the courtroom, "Oh, have you ever been desperate? Do you know what it means not to know what to do?" In the weeks leading up to the execution, Graham maintained her innocence while also seeming resigned to what was coming. She told a reporter at one point that paying for a life of little sins was how she saw it. But the way she spent her last day is what really set her case apart. The night before her execution, Graham spent the hours drinking a milkshake. When morning came, on the 3rd of June 1955, she ate a hot fudge sundae for breakfast. Then, she changed out of her red silk pajamas and dressed as though she were heading somewhere that mattered. A fitted champagne wool suit with matching covered buttons, brown high-heeled pumps, small gold drop earrings, and a crucifix around her neck. She weighed about 120 pounds, and her natural chestnut hair, which had grown back from being bleached blonde, looked soft and neat. At 10 a.m., she was ready to go. But then, California Governor Goodwin Knight issued a stay until 10:45. At 10:43, another stay pushed it to 11:30. Graham was livid. She protested, saying, "Why do they torture me? I was ready to go at 10 o'clock. For nearly 90 minutes, she had to sit in a holding cell knowing that the gas chamber was feet away and not knowing if she was walking toward it or away from it. At 11:28, guards finally came for her. By that point, having already braced herself twice and been pulled back, Graham was too shaken to walk on her own and had to be partially supported. She asked for a blindfold so she would not have to look at the faces of the witnesses watching her through the glass. As she was strapped into the chair, inside the pale green steel chamber, an official told her that taking a deep breath when the cyanide pellets dropped would make it easier. Graham fired back, "How the hell would you know?" Her last words were, "Good people are always so sure they're right." It took several minutes after the cyanide pellets dropped for the process to conclude, and witnesses described the scene as deeply disturbing. Emmett Perkins and Jack Santo were both executed later that same afternoon, making it the only time 3 people were put to death in California's gas chamber on the same day. Graham was the 3rd woman executed by gas in California. She was buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery in San Rafael, California, and her story became the basis for the 1958 film I Want to Live, which earned Susan Hayward the Academy Award for Best Actress. Ted Bundy.
The most notorious serial killer in the nation is scheduled to die tomorrow morning in Florida's electric chair.
Absurd to ask for mercy for something I did not do. So I will be tortured for and will suffer for and receive the pain for that act.
From 1974 to 1978, Ted Bundy kidnapped, assaulted, and took the lives of dozens of young women and girls across Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. Outwardly, nothing about him fit the profile. A University of Washington graduate, a political campaign volunteer, a crisis hotline worker. But behind that surface, Bundy was methodical and predatory, approaching women while pretending to be injured or posing as an authority figure, then overpowering them once they were alone. After committing 2 sorority house attacks, and the abduction and murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach in Florida, Bundy was captured and charged. The trial was broadcast on live television, one of the first of its kind, and Bundy represented himself, even using an obscure Florida law to marry his girlfriend Carol Ann Boone from the witness stand. 3 death sentences followed. For nearly a decade on death row at Florida State Prison, the appeals dragged on, and every single one was denied. Then, in January 1989, Florida Governor Bob Martinez signed the death warrant, saying Bundy had used legal maneuvering to dodge the electric chair for 10 years and that justice had been on hold long enough. In the days just before the scheduled execution, Bundy started talking, often crying. Bundy sat with investigators and described more than 30 separate acts across multiple states. It was the first time in his life that he had admitted to any of it, but even those confessions were calculated, an attempt to trade information for more time. The governor had already signed the death warrant a week earlier, saying Bundy had used legal maneuvering to dodge the electric chair for 10 years. It did not work. So, what did his last day actually look like? That evening, the 23rd of January, 1989, Bundy called his mother twice from Florida State Prison. In those phone calls, Bundy told her that he was sorry for all the grief and that a part of him had been hidden all the time. From there, Bundy spent the remaining hours weeping and praying with a Methodist minister named Fred Lawrence, who stayed with him into the early hours. By morning, roughly 500 people had gathered in the field across the road from the prison. When offered a last meal of his choosing, Bundy refused. The prison served the standard fare: steak, eggs, hash browns, and toast, around 4:50 a.m., but none of it was touched. Around 7 a.m., on January 24, guards walked Bundy into the execution chamber. By now, the hair on his head and right leg had been shaved for the electrodes, and witnesses said the 42-year-old looked startled when he first laid eyes on Old Sparky, Florida's electric chair. Strapped in and wearing a blue prison-issued shirt and slacks, Bundy was asked for final words. With a quavering voice, the man who had spent years performing for cameras and courtrooms managed only 12 words. Addressed to his lawyer, Jim Coleman, and the minister, "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." A metal skullcap was bolted onto his head, and a thick strap pulled across his mouth. At 7:06 a.m., 2,000 volts surged through his body. Witnesses reported his hands clenched, his body stiffened, and a thin curl of smoke rose from his right leg. Bundy was pronounced dead at 7:16 a.m. in front of 42 witnesses behind plexiglass. Outside the prison, roughly 500 people had gathered in a pasture. They were drinking beer, setting off fireworks, chanting, banging on frying pans, and waving signs. Vendors sold commemorative t-shirts referencing frying, and University of Florida students hosted a cookout nearby. As the white hearse carrying his body pulled away from the facility, the crowd outside erupted in cheers. There was no public funeral. Bundy was cremated in Gainesville, and in accordance with his will, his ashes were scattered at an undisclosed location in Washington's Cascade Range, the same mountains where the remains of at least 4 of his victims had been found. Wesley Allen Dodd.
In a few hours, convicted child killer Wesley Allen Dodd is due to die by hanging.
Washington State will enforce the ultimate penalty. Wesley Dodd will die for killing 3 small boys.
September 4, 1989. In a public park in Vancouver, Washington, a 28-year-old man named Wesley Allen Dodd attacked 2 brothers, 10-year-old William Neer and 11-year-old Cole Neer, stabbing both boys and leaving them to die. Less than 2 months later, on October 29, Dodd lured 4-year-old Lee Iseli away from a Portland park, brought the child back to his apartment, and assaulted him for hours before ending his life by hanging. Every detail of these crimes was later found in a diary Dodd had kept, written in calm, clinical language. What made Dodd different from many offenders is that none of this came as a surprise, even to people who knew him. By his own admission, the offending had started in his teenage years, beginning with his own cousins and then neighborhood children. Even while serving in the U.S. Navy, Dodd targeted children on the military base where he was stationed. After being captured in November 1989 trying to abduct another child from a movie theater, Dodd did not fight his fate. At sentencing, the 28-year-old told the courtroom that if he were not executed, he would escape and do it all over again, and that he would enjoy every minute of it. Washington State gave condemned inmates a choice between lethal injection and hanging, and Dodd chose the rope, specifically because that was how Lee Iseli had died. While on death row, Dodd wrote a self-defense pamphlet for parents and children, warning them about predators like himself. So how did Dodd actually spend his final day? On the 5th of January 1993, prison staff moved him to a holding cell inside the execution facility at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, around 4:40 p.m. Only 2 visitors came that day, his attorney and a member of the clergy who asked to remain anonymous. For his last meal, Dodd asked for whatever the general prison population was eating that night. nothing special. That turned out to be salmon, scalloped potatoes, mixed vegetables, coleslaw, and lemon cake. Prison spokesman Veltri Johnson confirmed that Dodd gave no indication of wanting to stop the execution at any point during the day. His attorney, who visited him in the holding cell, later said Dodd was probably calmer about the whole thing than anyone else in the room. Outside the prison, several dozen people gathered in the snow, split roughly evenly between supporters and opponents of the execution. State troopers arrested 3 men and a woman who tried to approach the prison grounds with candles about an hour before the scheduled time. Pro-execution, demonstrators set off firecrackers the moment the trap was sprung. Just before midnight, Dodd was brought up to the second floor of the indoor gallows. A 6-coil noose was positioned near his left ear, his hands were bound in front of him, and his legs were strapped together. Before the hood went over his head, Dodd addressed the room. The words came slowly. "I was once asked by somebody, I don't remember who, if there was any way sex offenders could be stopped. I said no. I was wrong. I was wrong when I said there was no hope, no peace. There is hope, there is peace. I found both in the Lord, Jesus Christ. Look to the Lord, and you will find peace." Down below, Leah Selly's mother, Jewel Cornell, reportedly hissed when Dodd mentioned Jesus. Claire Neer, the father of William and Cole, shook his head. At 12:05 a.m., a red button triggered an electromagnetic release that opened the trapdoor. Dodd dropped 7 feet into the room below. Reporters who witnessed the execution through a glass partition said it was swift and nearly silent, with no sign of struggle or suffering. At 12:09 a minute, the prison doctor confirmed death, making it the first legal hanging in the United States since 1965, nearly 28 years earlier. Afterward, the remains were transported to Seattle for autopsy and later cremated. Saddam Hussein. This case is different from anything else on this list. Saddam Hussein was the president of Iraq for over 2 decades, ruling from 1979 until a US-led coalition toppled his government and captured him in 2003. Under his regime, the state carried out mass violence on a scale that defined an era, from the use of chemical weapons on the Kurdish city of Halabja in 1988 to the brutal suppression of a Shiite uprising in 1991. But the specific crime that led to his death sentence was the 1982 Dujail massacre, in which roughly 148 people were executed in retaliation for a failed attempt on his life in the Shiite town of Dujail, after being pulled from an underground hideout near Tikrit on December 13, 2003. Looking disheveled and disoriented after months on the run, Saddam was tried before the Iraqi Special Tribunal and convicted of crimes against humanity. After the death sentence was read on November 5, 2006, Saddam shouted in the courtroom, "God is great. The Muslim Ummah will be victorious. Down with the spies." Then came the question of how the sentence would be carried out. Saddam requested a firing squad, arguing it was the proper military punishment for a commander-in-chief. That request was denied. The execution date was set for the 30th of December, 2006, which fell on the first morning of Eid al-Adha, one of the holiest days in Islam. That timing alone sparked international outrage. Critics argued that carrying out a death sentence on one of Islam's most sacred days was a deliberate provocation, while Iraqi officials maintained it was purely a matter of scheduling. On his last day, Saddam was held at Camp Justice, a joint Iraqi-American military base in the Qazimain district of Baghdad. A farewell letter had already been posted online days earlier, in which Saddam wrote that he was offering his soul to God as a sacrifice, and that if God willed it, he would be sent to heaven alongside the martyrs. Rather than prison clothing, Saddam wore a black suit, hat, and shoes. Hours before the execution, Saddam ate a last meal of chicken and rice with a cup of hot water and honey. Sami al-Askari, a political advisor to Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, later said that Saddam briefly resisted when Iraqi guards first took custody from the Americans. But as the moment drew closer and masked executioners placed a black cloth and noose around his neck, a calm settled over him. One witness later told the BBC that Saddam said they were going to heaven and their enemies would rot in hell, and that Iraqis should fight the Americans and the Persians. One thing Saddam would not accept was a hood. Looking directly at the people in the room, the former president stood unblinded. The Iraqi government released an official video of the proceedings, showing Saddam being walked to the gallows and the noose being fitted. But a second video, secretly recorded on a cell phone by someone present, told a very different story. In that footage, guards and witnesses taunted him in Arabic, chanting the name of Shiite cleric Muqtada al-Sadr. Saddam responded by repeating al-Sadr's name mockingly and asking, "Do you consider this bravery?" Through all of it, Saddam recited the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith. Midway through his second recitation, the trap door opened. The hanging took place at approximately 6:05 a.m. local time. Reaction was immediate and global, with Human Rights Watch calling the trial flawed and Amnesty International condemning the sentence. U.S. President George W. Bush later said, "The whole thing looked like a revenge killing." The leaked cell phone video spread across the internet within hours, and, in the days that followed, Saddam became something of a martyr figure among Sunni Arabs, which only deepened the sectarian tensions already tearing the country apart. Saddam's remains were returned to Al-Auja, near Tikrit, and buried in a family plot inside a domed building that he had ordered built years earlier. John Wayne Gacy.
Investigators have spent decades trying to identify victims in the John Wayne Gacy murders.
America's most notorious mass murderer. John Wayne Gacy killed 33 boys and young men during the late 70s and buried them under his Chicago home.
Between 1972 and 1978, John Wayne Gacy lured at least 33 young men and boys to his suburban Chicago home in Norwood Park Township, often under the pretense of a construction job. Once there, Gacy would trick victims into putting on handcuffs as part of a so-called magic trick, then assault, torture, and strangle them. 26 of the bodies ended up buried in the crawl space beneath the house, 3 elsewhere on the property, and 4 were dumped in the Des Plaines River. The arrest came in December 1978, after 15-year-old Robert Peast disappeared and was traced back to Gacy. A conviction on all 33 counts in 1980 sent Gacy to death row at Menard Correctional Center, where the man once known for performing as Pogo the Clown at children's events would spend the next 14 years. During that time, Gacy produced roughly 2,500 oil paintings, many of clowns, studied law to file his own appeals, and earned about $30,000 from artwork sales and a 900-number recording where callers could hear him argue his innocence. The state of Illinois actually sued him, arguing his prison earnings should cover the cost of his incarceration, while Gacy wanted every dollar to go to his family. But what were Gacy's final hours actually like? On the morning of the 9th of May, 1994, prison staff transferred Gacy to Stateville Correctional Center for the execution. That evening, a Catholic priest came in to deliver last rites. For his final meal, Gacy ordered a bucket of original recipe KFC chicken, a dozen fried shrimp, French fries, a pound of fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. The KFC was a fitting detail, as Gacy had once managed 3 KFC restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa, for his first father-in-law. What happened next looked less like a condemned man's final hours and more like a backyard picnic. Gacy sat on the prison grounds with family and friends, eating his meal in the open air, talking and socializing as if it were any other Sunday. A prison spokesman told the New York Times that Gacy had been chatty all day, making small talk about the Chicago Cubs and socializing with the people around him. Karen Conti, Gacy's attorney, later said that her client did not act like someone with hours left to live, choosing instead to spend his remaining time making the visitors around him comfortable rather than confronting what was coming. Neighbors who had lived near him for years were among those who came, and even after everything they still cared for him, something Conti described as both surprising and deeply emotional. Outside Stateville, the scene was anything but quiet. Hundreds gathered with signs and chants, and spectators laid out 33 body bags on the ground, one for each victim. Shortly after midnight on the 10th of May, 1994, Gacy was administered a 3-drug lethal injection. The first drug put him to sleep, but a clog in the IV line delayed the second injection for roughly 10 to 20 minutes, prompting attending anesthesiologists to blame the prison staff's inexperience. Once the third drug stopped his heart, Gacy was pronounced dead at 12:58 a.m., age 52. Before the injection, Gacy's final spoken words were reportedly directed at a prison guard and remain disputed to this day, though multiple sources described them as coarse and dismissive. Prosecutor William Kunkel, who had requested a front-row seat, later said Gacy got a much easier death than any of his victims. After death was confirmed, the brain was removed and given to forensic psychiatrist Dr. Helen Morrison, who had studied violent offenders for years and had been in contact with Gacy for a decade before the execution. Morrison kept the brain in her basement for years of future research, though she later reported that structurally, it appeared perfectly normal. What was left of the body was cremated. Eileen Wuornos.
Eileen Wuornos was a prostitute in Florida who robbed and killed 7 of her male clients in a 12-month span.
Between late 1989 and the fall of 1990, Eileen Wuornos shot and robbed at least 7 men along Florida highways while working as a sex worker. In every case, Wuornos claimed she was defending herself against assault, but the court saw a pattern that pointed to something far more calculated. Background matters here because few people on death row arrived there with a story quite like hers. Born on a leap day in 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, Wuornos never stood on stable ground. Her father, a convicted child offender, took his own life in prison, and her mother walked out before Wuornos turned 5. Raised by grandparents in a household marred by violence, Wuornos was living outdoors by her early teens, surviving in the woods near Troy, Michigan. At 14, she became pregnant after an assault, and the baby was placed for adoption. By the time of the killings, Wuornos had spent decades drifting, with a record that included armed robbery, assault, and forgery. The first victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics shop owner from Clearwater, shot in the woods after a late-night pickup. 5 more men followed in quick succession, and a 7th victim's body was never recovered. Arrested in January 1991, Wuornos was convicted the following year and received 6 death sentences in total. About 10 years passed on death row at Florida State Prison before the end came. During that time, Wuornos filed repeated complaints about prison conditions and claimed staff were psychologically abusing her. In media interviews during her final weeks, Wuornos said she felt misrepresented, that no one understood what her life on the road had actually been like. But those same interviews also raised serious questions about her mental state, with some statements veering into paranoia about mind control and conspiracy. Wuornos fired her attorneys and actively asked the Florida Supreme Court to stop all appeals, writing that she was one who seriously hates human life and would do it again. Governor Jeb Bush ordered a competency evaluation in September 2002, and 3 state psychiatrists concluded she understood her sentence. So what did the final morning look like? Prison staff woke Wuornos at 5:30 a.m. On the 9th of October 2002, a prison spokesman said she asked for a towel and washcloth to freshen up and was calm that morning, though quieter than she had usually been in the past. When offered a last meal of anything under $20, Wuornos turned it down entirely. All she had that morning was a single cup of black coffee. At 9:30 a.m., guards escorted her into the execution chamber and strapped her to the gurney. When the brown curtain was drawn back for the witnesses, Wuornos turned toward them, made what reporters described as a bizarre face, smiled briefly, rolled her eyes, and turned away. Then came her final statement, which lasted about 30 seconds. Without hesitation, she said, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day, with Jesus, June 6. Like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back." At 9:31, her eyes closed and her head jerked backward. By 9:32, her mouth had dropped open and all movement appeared to stop. Official time of death was 9:47 a.m. That made Wuornos the 10th woman executed in the United States since 1976 and the 2nd put to death in Florida since the reinstatement of the death penalty. At the last resort, a biker bar in Port Orange, Florida, where Wuornos had been arrested back in 1991, about 24 regulars gathered that morning to watch the news coverage, drinking coffee and beer as they waited for the announcement. Dawn Botkins, a childhood friend, later scattered the ashes under a tree in Michigan. The following year, Charlize Theron portrayed Wuornos in the film Monster and won the Academy Award for Best Actress. Carlton Gary.
A man known as the Stocking Strangler now has a new execution date.
Now, Carlton Gary was convicted and sentenced to death for the 1977 killings of 3 elderly women.
In September 1977, someone began breaking into the homes of elderly women in the upscale Winton neighborhood of Columbus, Georgia. Every attack followed the same pattern: entry at night, sexual assault, and strangulation, usually with the victim's own stockings or pantyhose. Between September 1977 and April 1978, 7 women were killed and 2 more survived, all of them living alone and ranging in age from 59 to 89. The local press called the unknown attacker the Stocking Strangler, and for months the city lived in fear. Community panic got so intense that a man calling himself the chairman of the forces of evil actually sent threats promising to target black women unless the strangler was caught, though that turned out to be a separate offender trying to cover his own crimes. Then, as suddenly as the attacks began, they stopped. For 6 long years, the case sat unsolved. In 1984, a gun stolen during a burglary in the Winton area back in 1977 was traced to a man named Carlton Gary, and fingerprints found at 4 crime scenes matched his. Gary was charged with 3 of the stocking strangler murders: the deaths of 89-year-old Florence Scheibel, 69-year-old Martha Thurmond, and 74-year-old Kathleen Woodruff. A 1,986 conviction and death sentence followed. From that point forward, Gary maintained his innocence and never wavered. Over 31 years on death row, his defense team raised questions about bite mark evidence that did not match his teeth, fingerprint analysis they called flawed, and DNA from one surviving victim's clothing that belonged to someone other than Gary. Courts repeatedly upheld the conviction anyway. In December 2009, a scheduled execution was halted just hours before the injection to allow for further DNA review, keeping Gary alive for nearly another decade. On the 23rd of February 2018, a new execution date was set for March 15. The final days played out with almost no fanfare, which itself tells a story. On March 14, the State Board of Pardons and Paroles denied clemency. That same day, the Georgia Supreme Court unanimously dismissed a last-ditch motion for a stay. Gary had also filed a handwritten motion that morning asking the court to postpone the execution and appoint a new attorney, writing that his lawyers had barely consulted with him since the date was set. That motion was dismissed too. Everything Gary had done for 3 decades, the handwritten appeals, the legal arguments, the insistence that DNA would clear him, all of it came to a stop on that final day. When the Georgia Department of Corrections asked Gary about a last meal, the answer came back no. Asked about a final prayer with the prison chaplain, again no. And here is where the silence becomes the story. Carlton Gary, a man described throughout his decades on death row as talkative, charismatic, and always ready to argue his case, chose to say nothing at all. No final statement, no last words, nothing. For a man who had spent 31 years telling anyone who would listen that the system had it wrong, that silence was louder than anything he could have said. Witnesses in the execution chamber at Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison in Jackson said Gary never opened his eyes, never spoke, and showed no visible emotion. Whatever was going on inside him, the man who had fought for 31 years decided, at the very end, to stop talking. At 10:33 p.m. on the 15th of March 2018, Carlton Gary was pronounced dead by lethal injection. Coincidentally, March 15 was the exact same date Gary had escaped from custody 35 years earlier, in 1983, setting off the chain of events that eventually led to his arrest and conviction. The woman he had married while on death row was not present. Among the witnesses were former detectives from the original Stocking Strangler investigation and the Columbus police chief. Gary was 67 years old. Gary's remains were sent to the GBI crime lab in Atlanta for autopsy and later released to his family.